Thousands of years ago, God made a covenant with one man named Abraham, a covenant that still shapes world history, Bible prophecy, and our understanding of God's faithfulness today. But why does the Abrahamic Covenant still matter? In this episode of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, we explore the life of Abraham, the covenant God made with him, and why that covenant remains foundational to theology, prophecy, and the trustworthiness of Scripture. Stay tuned to learn more.
Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, where we discuss all things Bible and theology because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and in today's program, we begin our Old Testament character study series with a study of one of the most important figures in all of Scripture, Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. This episode is a republished edition of a podcast originally recorded for the Learn the Word podcast, my former podcast during my time serving as the academic dean of the Word of Life Global Bible Institute, headquartered in New York, with permission, of course. I'm pleased to release it here on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast as a part of our Old Testament character series. To help us unpack the life and significance of Abraham, I'm pleased to introduce to you two outstanding guests from the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. First is Christopher Katulka. Chris serves as Vice President of North American Ministries for the Friends of Israel and hosts the Friends of Israel Today radio program and podcast. He's a contributor to Israel My Glory magazine and author of the book Israel Always, published by Harvest House. He's also a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. Also joining us is Steve Herzig. Steve Herzig is the retired Vice President of North American Ministries for the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. Steve is a respected Bible teacher, conference speaker, and author, specializing in Jewish customs, culture, and biblical theology. I'm grateful to have Dallas Theological Seminary as a sponsor of this podcast. Here at DTS, we offer flexible degree programs online, on campus, and at our teaching sites around the world with 19 unique degree programs, including doctoral degrees, master's degrees, and certificate programs. There's truly something for everyone. To learn more about studying at Dallas Theological Seminary, please visit dts.edu. Now let's turn our attention to Abraham, the man God called out of paganism to become the father of the chosen people. Well, today we're here to discuss Abraham. Today in this podcast, he's the father of the Jewish nation. As we know, Genesis 11 indicates that Abram, later God changes his name to Abraham, was from Ur, or Ur, and the land of the Chaldeans. Steve, where is Ur, and who are the Chaldeans?
You know, those are two good questions. And whenever you get scholars together, you're going to get varied answers. Generally speaking, we're talking about Mesopotamia, about 150 miles northwest of the Persian Gulf. Sometimes Ur is considered a city, so the Ur of Chaldees, and sometimes it's called a land of the Chaldeans. So the land mass is just around the Fertile Crescent, that area. What's interesting, early on in my ministry, I did some research. I was working on the University of Chicago campus, talking to students. And of course, higher criticism, even back in the Stone Age when I was young, higher criticism was a big deal. And I remember talking to them about the Ur and does it exist? And there at the University of Chicago, there's a museum because at one time before the turn of the 20th century, there was no Ur. Every expert says it doesn't exist. There isn't such a place. And so therefore the Bible's not true. That's a pretty strong statement and it's pretty strong evidence. But all of a sudden they found it. And when they found it, they found libraries and they found big roads. This was a pagan culture, but at the same time, fairly sophisticated. And I remember talking on campus and saying, hey, right here in the museum, it proves the validity of the Scripture. Yeah. And so that presents a strong argument. So, for those who listen about Ur of the Chaldees. Who cares about the Ur of the Chaldees? Well, we ought to care a great deal. There was a literal land of the Chaldeans, and thus there was a literal Abraham. I think that's significant, don't you?
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, the Christian faith, the Judeo-Christian faith is built on historical facts, isn't it? So the accuracy of the scriptures is important to all that's contained within it. And so I love archaeology, right? And it reaffirms and affirms what we already believe over and over and over again. And I'm thinking of the Newsy tablets, even when we think of the culture and history of that land, that region. It tells us a lot about that. And we're going to ask now, Chris, a question for you. What do we know about the culture from which Abram comes, later becomes known as Abraham? What about this culture? Is there anything we can learn about it from biblical texts or extra biblical sources?
Yeah, it's interesting because definitely Abram comes from an area that, like Steve already said, that was extremely polytheistic. They had a main god that kind of the people worshipped, but that he was more of the head god of a pantheon of gods that they had. His name was the god of sin. His name was Sin, actually, but it was a moon god, and he was kind of depicted as an old man with a long beard. He had a crown of four, kind of like showing exaltation in some way, beams that were coming from him, a headdress. But he was a man that was full of a God that was full of wisdom. And so the people of Ur, the Chaldeans, looked to him. And actually, this God permeates throughout the pagan culture from Mesopotamia for centuries. Actually, you'll see this God come up over and over again. The last time that he's kind of highlighted is when Nabonidus in around 500 BC tries to almost resurrect his exaltation, to try to say, this is our God. He's going to be the one who leads us. It doesn't work out that well for Nabonidus, because Nabonidus ends up, losing to the Persians. But all that to say that you can see traces of this God Sin throughout Mesopotamian culture. And what's interesting is there's a sanctuary in Ur that they found, a very large sanctuary to him. And there's also a sanctuary in Haran, which leads to the other part of the culture here, is that Abraham's people were very nomadic people. Nomads were people who moved around. They moved with their sheep. They moved with their goats to make sure that, remember, that's where your wealth was in your sheep, your goats, your cattle. And so they moved with them in order to feed them and find the best places for them. And so not only do you have this nomadic people in Ur, the family of Abraham, but they also, throughout the book of Genesis, they make a move from Ur, the Chaldees, all the way up to Haran. And you also see a sanctuary to Sin god there as well, the moon god, in Haran as well. So they're both a nomadic people and a very polytheistic people as well.
Steve, out of all the people in the world, why do you think Abram was chosen by God to be the father of the Jewish people?
Well, Abraham is such a critical person. I happen to have Jewish background. He's such a important part of where we are as a people. And the prophet Isaiah wrote in chapter 51, if I might, it says, "Listen to me, you who follow after righteousness, you who seek the Lord, look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father." So Abraham is the father of our faith. We go to Genesis chapter 12, and we know that Abraham was chosen by God and told to leave everything he knew. And Chris was just describing the background by which he came, and to leave it all and to follow him. And that would be the hallmark of Abraham for the rest of his life. The text says in Genesis 12:4, Abraham departed. God gave him a promise. We'll be talking about that. But immediately after God spoke to him, it must have been a dramatic entryway. The text doesn't say, but Abraham was locked and loaded in this culture, And all of a sudden, God reveals himself, however that was. I just have to say, man, he must have impacted him. He listened to what he said, and boom, he left. The writer of the book of Hebrews tells us that he obeyed, he dwelt, and he waited. Uh, he obeyed God when he spoke to him. He he dwelt in the land, and he waited for that city. And we're waiting for that city ultimately in the millennial kingdom. But there's a story that I heard growing up in Hebrew school that might be helpful for the context of how great Abraham is regarded amongst the Jews. And I'll make this story as short as I can. I heard it every year in Hebrew school. The same story, different teacher. We knew it by heart. And the teacher would talk about Terah owning a idol building shop, and he had all kinds of idols, big ones, little ones, short ones, fat ones. And he wanted Abraham to come along in the business. After all, Middle East, you come along in the business, your son's going to take over. So I schmaltz the story up a little, Paul. Schmaltz meat is chicken fat, which enhances the flavor. So it's like a fisherman telling a fish story. Uh, so off Abraham goes to the Starbucks. He's talking to his buddies about what a great son he has. And in the meantime, Abraham is looking at the store. He sees all these idols. There's a large one carrying a big axe. And so he gets the axe out of his hand and he smashes every single idol in the store. Then he puts the axe back in the big idol's hand. His father saying, "Oh, I'm going to go see how my son's doing. He's taking over the business." He walks into the shop, and they didn't have Yiddish in those days, Paul. But if they did, his father said, "Abe, what happened here?" And Abraham looks at his father and said, "Dad, you won't believe it. The idol over there went crazy. I couldn't stop him. He smashed every single idol in the store." Father looks at me and says, Abe, idols can't think. Idols can't walk. Idols can't do anything. Now remember, Paul, I heard this story every year. The class has heard this story. We've gone through it. We know it. But every single time when the teacher, who told it their own particular way, but every time they came to the part, idols can't do everything, the room got quiet. And the teacher said, Abraham looked into the eyes of his father and he said, "Father, do your ears hear what your mouth has just said?" Well, look, one thing about us as a people, we wrote the book, we wrote about sin, we did it all. But one thing, and even an atheistic Jewish person would say, we don't believe in idols. We are not in any of this stuff. And that makes a huge impact, made a huge impact on me. Abraham was a man of faith. He believed. I think he believed because God made a huge impact on him in the midst of paganism. But I think we can make that argument even today in the church when we hear a testimony. God made a big impact and takes us out of what we're in and puts us into a new family. And that's exactly what happened to Abraham. Abraham, a man of faith, as the writer to the Hebrews says, coming out of that pagan background, a rock from which hewn. That's a powerful statement that the prophet Isaiah says. So Abraham's a biggie for us, but we know he's a biggie for Christians, right, Chris?
Exactly. Yeah, he is a huge person for Christians. He's the father that would eventually become the father of even those that spiritually are grafted into the tree, if you will. So yeah, it's really important.
So, Steve, you became a follower of Jesus as the Messiah in college, or what was that?
Right after college, believe it or not, there was light bulbs and electricity and air conditioning in 1975. I flew on an airplane, got to California. I was looking for a vacation and a time to visit my sister and brother-in-law. And it was there that I was introduced to the Friends of Israel at a Bible study because they were serving free bagels, lox, and cream cheese. And as a poor student, just graduated, free bagels, lox, and cream cheese was a good deal, but I ended up with a bigger deal than that.
And praise the Lord. That's awesome. Well, Chris, we've talked a little bit about the culture now. As we know in Genesis 12, Abraham is commanded to leave his people, to leave his land that he grew up, everything he was familiar with, and his family, go to a new land. Why do you think this was essential for God's purposes?
Yeah, God calls Abraham, and I'll read it really quick, if you don't mind, Paul. But from Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it says, go from your country, your people, your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so this is a multifaceted promise for Abraham. It's a promise of a land, which means he's going to be a nation, and a promise of a people that will make up that nation. So he's got a land and a people. He's got protection. I'm going to bless those who bless you, Abraham, curse those who curse you, and then a purpose and a mission that through you, Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so there's a reason that God chose the land. God could have just set him up right there in Haran or set him up in Ur. Why? The reason he chose Canaan is, I think, actually really important to the providence of what God is doing, the purposes of what God is doing. See, today in evangelicalism and Christianity, we send out missionaries. We send them out. We train them, and God gives them a call to go somewhere. And in the Old Testament, it was actually quite different. God commanded Abraham to go to a land he didn't know, but then he wanted Abraham and his people to obey them right where they were in that land. And if you actually look at where Israel is today, it's one of the most strategic locations in the entire world, because it actually is a link, a bridge that connects 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And so if you wanted to move from Egypt up into Persia, you would have to go through Israel. If you wanted to go from the Turkey and Europe down into Egypt, you had to go through Israel. Israel was a land bridge. You needed to go that way. So essentially, as trade was moving in and out, and we know that there were sophisticated highway systems actually that were working all throughout Israel at that time. There's actually a book that I'm going through right now called The Roads and Highways of Ancient Israel, and there were 37 exits, like on a highway, all throughout the land. And so what you see is the significance of Israel as the world is actually coming to Israel, and the world is funneling through. And so God actually placed Abraham and his people strategically in a land so that as they moved through the land, they would interact with the people who worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true God. And, today we live in a very monotheistic culture, but if you could imagine what it would be like in a very polytheistic culture, to go through a land where people say, we only believe in one God, the creator God of the universe. And this would have been mind-blowing to them. They would have left that land and traveled throughout the world sharing who this God is. So God kind of placed them right in the middle of the world and allowed the world to work and come through them so they could, I believe, communicate the message of who God is. Providential placement.
Yeah, that's great. I love that picture that you see throughout Israel, right? It almost looks like a flower, right? The center is Israel that has like 3 parts of the flower top. And I'll probably put that in here for those who are viewing the YouTube channel. But it shows that connection, right? That Israel was right in the middle of these 3 continents. And that's great when Israel is and will be the center of the world. But it's not so great when it's the battlegrounds of ancient history, right?
It's true. And what's interesting is actually
before planes and before boats, right? They had to come through Israel and destroy cities along the way oftentimes.
Yeah, there's a place in Israel called Megiddo, and actually it's the most narrow point where that international highway system kind of narrows in, and it became so strategic that there have been battles that have been fought that go back to prior to the Canaanite period, all the way up even into World War I. It's actually the area that we know of as called Armageddon. It's called Megiddo. In Revelation, they crammed the Hebrew together, Har Mountain, Megiddo, the area, and that's where we get the term Harmageddo is Armageddon. And so there's even a future battle that takes place there. But that's because every culture, every people group knew the significance of Israel. And Megiddo was the most narrow point of this ancient highway system. If you controlled Megiddo, which is essentially Israel, you controlled world trade. So everybody wanted a piece of Israel. That's why it was so valuable to God on a spiritual, economic worldview, that God would use Israel to bless the world, putting them right in the center of it.
Interestingly enough, in Ezekiel 5 and verse 5, Paul, exactly what you were saying, thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem is in that, obviously, the capital of Israel. I have set her in the midst of the nations and the countries all around her. In God's eyes, as hard as it is as Americans living in North America, I deal with North America. It's a significant in size and economy. In God's eyes, the center of everything is Israel. And yes, what Chris was saying, Israel is so strategic geographically. It's strategic even weather-wise. You read Leviticus, and which few people do, but if you do choose to read Leviticus, you'll find that there are 7 feasts, and those 7 feasts are heavily involved in agriculture and the reliance on water. That area, that land bridge that Chris described, is vitally dependent on a very short window of water. It's so significant. Water plays a key role, and yet there it is. God is not just demonstrating with it, as we're talking about Abraham and his faith. That faith has to be continual. The Jewish people today, believe it or not, have to believe that rain's going to come, and the source of the rain is God. And if that doesn't happen, and we read about it often as we read progressively through the text, even the location where Israel is as the center of the earth. Abraham is a man of faith, and God wanted him to birth a people of faith. Well, we failed at that time, but nonetheless, strategic choice in Abraham.
Well, and we've emphasized the land, but as far as it's so important, we can't emphasize it enough. But he also left his culture, right? Could you speak to that a little bit? There's certainly, maybe Steve, you want to, certainly God wanted him to be a separate people, right? Not to be impacted by the gods that they are coming from.
That started early on in terms of demonstrating that you are called out people. Even Abraham, dealing with his own family, told Lot, choose where you want. I'll take the rest. God separated him. And as you follow Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the law comes to us, the whole idea of separation, by the way, separation is an issue in the church. It's always been an issue. In Judaism, it's an issue. We have to be a separate people. That's by God's grace. He kept us separate. And in Abraham's day, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you trace the seed, they had to be a separate people in order for that special seed to come. So God was very strategic, using faith. It's always faith, but as he takes progressively those people along, and we see the plan of God through that seed, we realize that yes, separating them, they have to live differently, they have to eat differently, they have to worship differently, they dress differently. It marks us out. And I've found in my life, Chris could probably comment on it too, that stress that God has given to the Jewish people, which, by the way, our people continually rebelled against it. My own father, coming from a very Orthodox family, rebelled against it. And by the time he was in his 20s, up to World War II, he becomes part of the culture. Assimilation. Assimilation has been part of our people for a long time, and it affects the church. The stress in the church is, what does it mean to be separated? And legalism and all that. It all comes back to Abraham, a man of faith. So we follow God. So I can't emphasize verse 4 enough in chapter 12, where it says Abraham departed.
Mm-hmm.
He departed. How tension-filled is that statement? I can tell you my own life. I remember having to leave my father and mother after I became a believer. They were very, very upset, and I knew I had to depart. It's very difficult. You have these roots, you have this tradition, you have your security in your family. Abraham departed, he forsook all that. And that's really the path of Christians. When we become born again, we're not faced, all of us, thank God, with leaving family and all that. But the idea is you're on your own. This is something you're walking this journey alone. And Paul, you could probably testify that journey, regardless of your family background. It's Abraham departed, it resonates or should resonate with believers.
That's great. Great stuff.
Hello, friends. In just a moment, we will return to our previously recorded conversation. But first, I want to take just a moment to share with you an exciting opportunity that I believe is truly strategic for the cause of Christ. And I want to invite you to be a part of it. At the end of June, in less than a month, I will be traveling to Buenos Aires, Argentina, for a teaching trip that I believe is strategic. I will be teaching a full course on Christian apologetics, how to defend the faith, to approximately 140 students who are coming from all across Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world. Over 20 hours of teaching, equipping these future pastors, teachers, and Christian leaders with the tools they need to answer the hard questions and stand confidently on the truth of Scripture. And then, after that is over, I will be presenting a full-day conference on biblical archaeology at one of the most influential churches in Buenos Aires. This conference on biblical archaeology will be highlighting the discoveries in my book, Faith Affirming Findings, to an entirely new audience. This is how you can be a part of this strategic ministry trip. With the surging costs of airfare and travel, the total cost of this trip is approximately $2,200. If God lays it upon your heart to help make this trip possible, every gift, large or small, makes a real difference. You can give simply visiting FIM for Fellowship International Mission, fim.org/give/Weaver. That's fim.org/give/Weaver. The giving link will also be right there in the show notes. Thank you for your prayers, and thank you for your consideration of investing in the cause of Christ alongside me. Now back to our previously recorded program. So we've talked about the land, we've talked about a seed briefly there, and there's going to be a blessing we're going to talk about now as well. Can you, Steve, talk about the Abrahamic Covenant?
Chris already said, first of all, this covenant is unconditional. Very important. That means that once Abraham decided he was leaving, once you have the depart part, everything else is the responsibility of God. That doesn't mean Abraham didn't have any responsibility. He did.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean that the Jewish people didn't have any responsibility. They do. And they did then. But even if they or we don't follow what we're supposed to, God was committed to giving them a land. And you can, you go to Israel today, and you can see the Jewish people there and the fighting over the land and the safety, security of the land and the return and all that. God made a promise, and that's going to happen. So you have the land, you have the seed, the blessing. There you got to go to the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31, and that's a new covenant. And that new covenant is one that affects the church to some degree. Even though God says, I'm going to remove that heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. Jeremiah is the same prophet who talks about a circumcised heart. A circumcised heart. How's that possible? We know what circumcision is. Very important in Judaism. Circumcision. Thank God no Jewish child remembers it. I can tell you they ate, they drank at mine, and I had no clue about it. But I can tell you this, blood was shed. Blood was shed. So what's it mean to have a circumcised heart? What is Jeremiah talking about? And what is this new covenant Abraham is talking about? That new covenant has to do with a circumcised heart. You remember Nicodemus. I got my ends wrong. In John chapter 3, he has no idea what it means to be born again. And Jesus seems to indicate that he should. He's a teacher in Israel. Why doesn't he understand it? Deuteronomy 30 talks about a circumcised heart. Jeremiah talked about a circumcised heart. Why doesn't he understand? Circumcised heart is the same thing as being born from above. It's God's spiritual surgery. God has to do surgery. That new covenant is promised to Israel, and it's going to happen, I believe, Revelation chapter 19. The Lord Jesus Christ is going to descend. He's got fire in his eyes. He's going to speak but the word. And there, what we call Armageddon, that last battle, and the prophet Zechariah says, they shall look upon him. And who's the they? That's the Jewish people. Whom they pierced. Yes, we are guilty. Whom they pierced, and they shall mourn for him. Mourn. They're going to weep. They're going to look and realize who the Savior is. Their hearts will be circumcised. They're going to believe. They're going to welcome the Messiah. His feet will touch down on the Mount of Olives. And so this covenant, this blessing, is not just extended to Israel, although that's who it was promised to. It's going to extend to this other people, this called out people, people who are Jewish and Gentile from every tribe, kindred, nation, and tongue. You and I, we're part of that new covenant where we, by God's grace, can be saved and be brand new creatures. It's an amazing promise to Abraham that, again, affects everybody thereafter.
Nice. And one of the reasons that we love Friends of Israel and Word of Life have so much in agreement is based upon this Abrahamic Covenant. We believe it's unconditional, but there are others that don't. Chris, convince some of our listeners that maybe aren't yet convinced or haven't thought about it or even realized there are those that treat the Abrahamic Covenant as either conditional or somehow fulfilled in some symbolic way. Why is the Abrahamic Covenant unconditional?
Yeah, Abraham comes into the land. He was promised land, descendants, blessing. I'm going to give you land, Abraham, descendants, and a blessing. And Abraham comes in and he's there and he's looking around. And by Genesis chapter 15, he looks around and he goes, hey, I have land. I've been protected. There's a blessing there, but I'm missing one major component. And that major component is actually descendants. He has no children. And he looks to God and he says, the only person that will inherit everything that you're giving to me is Eliezer of Damascus, who some think is some type of relative or even a servant in some way. And God, he says, how will I know that you're going to fulfill this promise? How am I going to know you're going to give me every aspect of this promise, God? I got the land, I got the blessing, I'm missing the kid. What's going on here? And the Lord calms Abraham. You can sense Abraham's worked up. And it's funny, he tells Abram to grab certain elements of a covenant. He says, bring me a heifer, bring me a goat and a ram, and each 3 years old, along with a dove and young pigeon. And it's almost as if Abraham knows exactly what's about to happen here. Because Abram knows that he's about to make a covenant with God. God's going to cut, actually, a covenant with him. And it says Abram brought these things to him in Genesis chapter 15, verse 10. And he started cutting them in two and arranging them in halves opposite of each other. It says the birds, however, he did not cut in half. And then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So Abram knows what's going on here. God is actually enacting an ancient ritual that was a covenant ritual where they bring animals and they cut them in half. And what they would do in this time is, if God wasn't involved, if it was just a simple human interaction or a human covenant going on, the two men would have linked arms with one another and walked through these pieces together. This would happen during land transactions or any oaths or covenant that was being made between two individuals. They would cut these animals in half and then they would walk through them together. And so they would link arms. And the reason they would do this, because it sounds very weird, they would do this because they were saying to one another, if you don't live up to your end of the bargain, you're going to end up like one of these animals. You'll be cut in half. I'm going to kill you. I'm coming after you. And so God, actually, the thing that makes this promise unconditional is not the covenant itself, the animals that are being cut. It's the person who's actually making the covenant. And that's why it says here, as the sun went down, Abram falls asleep. So Abraham goes off to the side and Abram is sawing logs. And it's in this moment, it says this, darkness falls and God makes a promise to Abram that he's going to give him this land, and all the promise will see its fulfillment throughout time. It says the sun had set And a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. And it's fascinating because Abram didn't walk through the pieces. God made a covenant with Abram, but Abram wasn't there. It was only the Lord. So that means only God is the one whose name is written on the deed, period. And because of that, it actually says in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13, that it was the reason God was the only one who went through the pieces was because he could swear by nothing greater to make sure that this covenant would be fulfilled. If Abram would have walked through those pieces with God, it would have made it a conditional promise. It would have fallen apart because Abram is human. He would have failed, sinned, as we know he did, and he would have lost his way and the covenant would have been broken. But because it's God's name and it's his holy reputation on the line, he will fulfill this promise. And you see it traced throughout the scriptures, this promise that God made to Abraham. You see it all throughout the Old Testament, and you see it all throughout the New Testament, that this covenant must find its fulfillment. It's not there yet. God's not done with it. And so I believe it's unconditional because it's God's holy name on the deed, which makes it eternal and holy.
Steve, would you
Well,
like to add to that?
Paul, Genesis 15, as Chris just outlined for us, is such a critical chapter. I know everybody goes to Genesis 12, and they should. I mean, that's the beginning. But Genesis 15, two things happen. Chris described one, but just before that, it tells us what really happened in Genesis 12, but is so vital. Abraham believed God. Think about that. Abraham believed God. And as a result of that, imputation took place. The biblical words for me, I've always had trouble with scholarly words. What imputation? What does that mean? Well, when you give your credit card to somebody, you give that card. I've seen people who've never seen a credit card come from another country. This was years ago again. They give a card. I was with a person from Russia. You give the card, and you walk away with your groceries. First, how do you do that? You didn't give them any money. Oh no, I gave them where do I get a card like that? How can I get all these groceries well, the imputation, the charge goes there. It goes into that account. And that's Abram believed God, and as a result, it was imputed. It was placed in his account. What was righteousness? And so now Abraham, we're affirmed that he's a believer, and he's ready to do this very cultural thing that Chris described. How'd you like to buy a house today or a car today, and you have to do a do-si-do between pieces that says, if I don't pay on this house or this car, I'm going to get killed.
That does happen, Steve. That does happen. It's called mortgage.
Yeah, we sign our name. Okay, the repo man could take your car. Your house could be repossessed. But in those days, if you did it, you're dead.
Well, Chris is taking his loans from not from a bank, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Maybe a mafia. So, but the land as well. So we're going, of course, the Davidic covenant, and as you alluded to, the new covenant, even it really helps expand and help us better understand that a lot of that is tied to the Abrahamic covenant as well, isn't it?
100%. The land and all of that is actually, I think, uniquely connected. There's a universal nature to the Abrahamic covenant, as Steve was talking about. The universal nature is the purpose that God gives the Jewish people. You know, God didn't choose Abraham and say, I'm done with all these other people in the world. I'm choosing you now, Abram. You know, no, it was actually God. Abram was chosen in order to bring blessing to all the families of the earth. And so there's a universal nature to what the importance of the land is all about. And I always think a lot of times people go, oh, that land, it's only for the Jewish people. It's for the Jewish people. God called Abraham to that land. But Jesus is going to rule from that land and bless all the nations of the earth. There's a universal element to it that all the nations will stream, Micah chapter 4. All the nations will stream to Jerusalem to receive Torah, to receive law, instruction from the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's the point, is that the nations will come to Israel at some point. And so there's a universal nature as well to this Abrahamic promise that's really important to understand.
So as we talk about that, what are some of the implications for regarding the Abrahamic covenant for Israel in the future and for the church?
Well, when you think in terms of the covenant for Israel, there's a land in Genesis 15. We've been parked there for a while. He outlines all the land that's given, and in fact, Israel's never had all that land. Even under Solomon, they've never had all that land, and that will take place, we believe, during the 1,000-year rule, where the land will be expanded. And as Chris talked about, this is a God of grace. So yes, Israel's promised this land, but what's it for? People are going to come to worship the King. They're going to that particular place. They're going to be reminded of a whole program that God gave to them. So how does that affect the church? Well, there's some today who say, no, we're just waiting for Jesus. God's done with Israel. That whole aspect is not what we believe. I think if you eliminate the Jewish aspect of it, you eliminate a lot of blessing and a lot of fullness to the story. We always say, Chris does almost every rep. You had Tom Simcox. I know he says it as well when Tom preaches. If God is not faithful to the promise that he gave to Israel, in other words, if the promises we're talking about here, Paul, that you're spending a whole session with us talking about, if that promise is not true, then God has not fulfilled his promise. He's a promise. He doesn't keep his promise. Well, what about us then? Why would the church have why would we believe the things we do if God is simply saying, believe this, but hey, it might not happen. It might not happen. I'm telling you it is, but it might not. Wait, that's happened to me as a dad. To my shame, I didn't keep every single promise I ever gave to my kids. And by the way, still they remind me of that. We're human, but if God is faithful, that is, if in the millennial kingdom, the promise of Abraham is true, and as Chris outlined, they come to the land of Israel, that's a reminder to the God who never changes. He's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And so if God is faithful to the Jewish people, today, as the church, we're looking, things going on in the church today. Well, wait a minute, God gave a promise to them. When God says to us, you are sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise. Is that temporary? Is that, can we count on it? Oh yeah, the reason you can count on it is look what he's done for the Jewish people. He promised them a land, and they got the land. They're going to get the land. There's blessing. So if God is faithful to the Jew, I always say God will be faithful to you. If he breaks one promise, one, to anybody, then the whole thing comes tumbling down and Satan wins. No, God keeps his promise based, as Chris described earlier in our conversation, based on his holy name. God is who he is. He's the great I am.
And I'll also add this too. Steve and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. But Steve, you're 99% Jewish, aren't you? Or 90?
Actually, it was updated. Yeah, I did my DNA. It was 98. And so I thought, oh, my mother was 100. My father's deceased. So I said, oh, 98, that must mean somewhere back. But the company that we did our DNA reported back, yes, it's true. 100%.
But
look, the map of Israel's on this space. What are you going to do?
But that's the thing, Paul. When I think about the Abrahamic promise and the unconditional nature of it, Steve Herzig and the Jewish people represent less than 1% of the world's population. And this is a group of people that have been through turmoil, persecution, anti-Semitism. They should have disappeared off the map, many, many millennia ago. And yet somehow Steve is still here to tell you, based on a DNA test, I'm 100% Jewish. And on top of that, I can get you on an airplane right now and fly you to a Jewish state called Israel, where there are Jewish people that live and worship God. And it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. there is an amazingness to the fact that they were dispersed all around the world. They could have assimilated a long time ago. They didn't. They maintained an identity of the Jewish identity. They were returned to the land. No other people group have ever done that before. No other people group have resurrected an ancient language to become their national language. How is this possible? Statistically, it's impossible. It's possible because God made an unconditional promise to Abraham, and it's his holy reputation on the line. And so because his holy reputation is on the line, he's going to make the impossible possible. So that is honestly, if there is a reason to believe that the Abrahamic Covenant still exists today, you just got to open up your newspaper and see Israel. Israel makes a peace deal with the UAE, with Bahrain. Oh, how is that possible? Because of God's Abrahamic promise that he made. It's unconditional. That's the reason.
That boggles my mind. I think that's a very strong argument from human history, and seeing all Satan's a Bible scholar, right? He knows what God has recorded. He knows God's plans and purposes, and he's been trying to annihilate the Jewish people ever since. And so human history tells us that God has a plan for the nation of Israel still, and that's to be fulfilled in the Abrahamic Covenant. Well, we're running out of time for this episode, but we can't not highlight the event that takes place involving Abraham's faith and his son, right? At the age of 100 years old, Sarah gives birth to a son to Abraham. And the very next chapter, chapter 22, God tests Abraham. And it's not a small test either. Chris, could you summarize that briefly for us and tell us why that's significant, that event?
Yeah, there's a lot of implications for a Christian here, but it's actually called the binding of Isaac in Judaism, or Akedah, which means the binding. And it's the account of when all of a sudden, finally Abraham gets the son he's been wanting. And now God calls him to sacrifice this son. He actually uses the words in Genesis chapter 2, your one and only son, your unique son. And there's some unique connection that's there. I'll mention later on in the New Testament. But basically, Abraham goes to Mount Moriah, which is Jerusalem, where actually the Temple Mount, where the Jewish temple will stood in history past, but for Abraham and where he is, will one day be built. So he goes to the tip of this mountain, Mount Moriah, and there he is called to offer, his son. And actually, it's interesting that Abraham almost seems to know what to do. And that's because pagan cultures at that time would offer up their firstborn children sometimes in light of hoping that God would provide fertility for more kids. Kids were a blessing back then. You wanted as many kids as possible. And so Abraham almost knows what to do in this moment, but it's an interesting thing. Isaac picks up on all of it as they're going up this mountain. Dad, you got the knife, you got the wood. I'm not seeing the sacrifice here. And it's interesting because Abraham, with his faith, knows that God's going to provide a sacrifice, if you will. He will provide a lamb, it even says. And so, Isaac and him go up there, and in the thicket, just as it's all about to go down, the knife is about to come down on Isaac. A messenger from the Lord calls out to Abraham and says, don't sacrifice your one and only son. And there was a ram that his horns were stuck in the bush. And so he ends up becoming, the ram becomes the substitute for Isaac, essentially, which really paves the path for what we call in the academic world, substitutionary atonement. There's a substitute that God provides for the one and only son that Abraham had that would continue this promise that God made to Abraham. And so it's interesting when you get to John chapter 3, verse 16, there is that same idea that God gave his only son, his one and only son. There's that unique connection between what happened with Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, and the fact that God would give his one and only son, John chapter 3, verse 16. And so there's that unique connection there. But you see that there's this picture of what becomes substitutionary atonement. God would provide a sacrifice in light of the penalty that we deserve to pay, which is death. God would provide a way for us to have life. So there's those images that are there in Genesis chapter 22.
It's awesome. Well, gentlemen, as we wrap up today's podcast, we could spend 3-4 different sessions on just the character of Abraham and the promises made to him. But as we wrap up today's podcast, are there some lessons we can learn from the life of Abraham, this man of faith, and the covenant that God made with him?
I just like to make one point. Chris probably has more, but for me, if you look in Genesis chapter 12, it says that Abraham departed. So he left. And Chris just got through describing the story from Genesis 22 that Jewish people read on Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. Every year we read that story. And in verse 3, it says, after God told him to take his one and only son, as Chris talked about, in verse 3, it says, so Abraham rose early. I think if that would have been me, I would have slept in that morning. But he rose up early, which means that from the time of Genesis 12 to the time of Genesis 22 and all in between, with foibles and difficulties and everything, we could say Abraham was faithful. Abraham was faithful. He was consistent. Again, in the paradigm of humanity and sin, he was consistent. He believed God. And for me, the application is we can be an Abraham. We can have Abraham-like faith. We can look into the future based on a promise we have and not know how it's going to happen, whatever we were promised, including our own salvation and glorification, but believe like Abraham and just be consistent. The best thing a Christian can do is to wake up the next morning that's given to him and be the same faithful person he was the day before. Faithfulness is the key.
That's great.
Yeah, I would say for me, the one thing I love about Abraham is his honesty with God throughout his entire life that we know from the scriptures. You see moments of doubt in Abraham, especially when God gives him the covenant. He says, all right, God, I believe, like Steve said, and God accredited his faith, his belief, his righteousness. It's amazing, amazing verse. And then just as God says, you're righteous because of your faith. And then all of a sudden, Abraham looks at God and goes, but how will I know? There is that element of both faith and then doubt. And I think that always plagues the life of a believer. And I think I love to see the father, that Abraham, a true hero in the story of the Bible, dealt with areas of doubt and faith. And then also the fact that he was honest with God in prayer. God, you said you would do this. You said that you would fulfill your promise. How? Come on, God. I wonder, is this going to happen? You see real honesty coming from Abraham in his life journey throughout the scriptures. So I love those portions. They always encourage me because it lets me know I'm not too far off in my moments of faith and doubt. And also, when I want to be honest with God, it doesn't have to be this holy prayer I give. It can just be, God, what's going on here? Are you going to fulfill the promise? And so I love those moments with Abraham.
That's amazing. That's great. I'm thankful for the honesty of our text, right? It's not like any other ancient writing. It doesn't gloss over the failures either, but only highlight the victories. But we get to see a real honest glimpse of Abraham and of David and the men and women of the faith, both their victories and their failures. And it's an honest record, right? It's based on historical facts.
Amen.
I appreciate that as well. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I want to thank my guests once again, Christopher Katulka and Steve Herzig of the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, for helping us better understand the life, faith, and theological significance of Abraham and the covenant promised to him. If today's conversation encouraged you, would you take a moment to subscribe to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast wherever you listen to it? You can also help others discover the program by leaving a review, sharing this episode with a friend, ministry leader, or Bible study group. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you'll know when new episodes are released. A special thank you to Dallas Theological Seminary for sponsoring this program. For over a century, DTS has been committed to teaching truth and loving well by preparing students for faithful ministry around the world. Also, my new book on biblical archaeology entitled Faith Affirming Findings, published by Kriegel Academic, is now available at Amazon and through Kriegel.com. Please join Chris Katulka, Steve Herzig, and myself next week as we continue our Old Testament character series with a look at the life and ministry of David and a discussion of the Davidic Covenant. It's another rich biblical and theological conversation you won't want to miss. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology really does matter, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.